All right, so today we're looking at 3.2 carbohydrate and fat metabolism. We're going to look at how carbohydrates and fats work in the body to provide us with energy. Okay, so to begin, we'll firstly look at metabolism. So what is metabolism? And it's basically the sum of all of the biochemical reactions going on in your body that keep you alive. They can be through catabolic or anabolic processes, and we're going to look at this in a few slides. But you might have heard people say they've got a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism before. They're basically referring to whether or not their body is efficient at converting food into energy. That can be good for athletes who need energy and need to be able to recover quickly after exercise. But in basic forms, our metabolism is made up of 4 key elements. BMR is the biggest percentage, makes up the biggest percentage of our metabolism. So if you look at this table, along the y-axis, we've got the percentage of daily energy expenditure. So BMR, or basal metabolic rate, is the amount of energy we burn at rest. We're not moving around, we're just resting, we're sitting down at our work, listening to this lecture. That's your BMR working, that's your basal metabolic rate. The next biggest contributor is NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and there's also EAT, which is exercise activity thermogenesis. This includes physical activity like walking to the car and voluntary physical activity like going to the gym, and NEAT is like taking the stairs. It's not physical, voluntary, purposeful exercise, but it's the exercise that we do today, day to day, whereas EAT is like the purposeful exercise. And then finally, there's TEF up there, the little one, which is the thermic effective feeding. And the thermic effective feeding is the energy that it takes to digest the foods that we eat. So when we eat food, we need to use energy to digest them, to be able to get energy from them when we're doing our exercise and so on. So firstly, if we look at the biggest component of metabolism, that's our basal metabolic rate. It's the energy expenditure during rest, and it makes up 50 to 70% of total energy expenditure in most adults. And as we get older, our basal metabolic rate tends to decline about 1 to 2% per decade from 20 years. So basal metabolic rate is sort of what people are referring to when they say I have a high metabolism. It means that they're burning a lot of energy at rest. They can get away with eating more throughout the day and burning that off, and not having it gather as adipose tissue or fat. Now, the reason why it tends to decline when we get older is because we have big changes in our body composition. So when we age, we have an increase in fat mass and a decrease in fat-free mass, and that fat-free mass is our muscle. So we know that muscle is more metabolically active than adipose tissue. And what that means is that if we're losing the muscle and gaining the adipose tissue, we're going to have a decline in the metabolic rate, in the basal metabolic rate, because muscle, if you have more muscle mass, you're going to increase your basal metabolic rate, right? Muscle uses that energy during rest more so than adipose tissue or fat does. Okay, now if we look at how physical activity changes across the lifespan, we can see with these graphs, we've got age on the bottom, and then we've got a few different components in those columns. So basal metabolic rate in white, diet-induced energy expenditure, and activity-induced energy expenditure. I want you to look at the activity-induced energy expenditure for the most part. So if we look at that first graph from 20 to 34 compared to 35 to 49 years old, the activity-induced energy expenditure is very similar. There's not much of a significant difference between those two parts of the column. Versus 60 to 74, we see that part of the graph significantly decrease, right? That dark gray area has really declined, and then it declines even more when we get to 75 plus. And these two different graphs here are just showing men versus women, but we see the same trend in both, that the activity-induced energy expenditure decreases. So if we have a look at that again, we see our activity on the y-axis and our age on the x-axis. And as you can see, as we get older, for both males and females, we have a decline in the total daily energy expenditure. TEE is total energy expenditure. So the big question is if I go to the gym every single day in older age, can I avoid these problems? Can I avoid losing my metabolic rate? Can I keep my metabolism high? Because I'm not exercising as much as I was. I don't have that activity-induced energy expenditure like I used to when I was in my 20s and 30s. So can we mitigate the decrease in our total daily energy expenditure by doing more exercise? So this is a really interesting question. If you think, okay, I can see that my metabolism declines as I get older, what if I just start doing more exercise when I get older? And it's really interesting because an increase in energy expenditure associated with training seems to be offset by a decreased voluntary energy expenditure at other times of the day. Now, it's a bit of a complicated way of saying that it's very interesting to see that when people do purposeful exercise, like going to the gym, going for a run, whatever it is, they actually tend to decrease the non-purposeful exercise that they do during the day. So what I mean by that is, think about yourself in this scenario. Let's say you go to the gym in the morning, then you get into work and your office is on the 5th level of the building. If you've done your exercise in the morning, you're much more likely to think, oh, I've done my exercise for the day, I'm going to get the elevator now. I don't need to take the stairs, I've already done the exercise. And this is a pattern that actually happens. So the more purposeful exercise you do, you actually tend to reduce the non-purposeful exercise and tend to perform more sedentary activities like taking the elevator rather than taking the stairs. If you're aware of it, you can make that decision to not let that exercise that you've done earlier in the day bias you into a different choices. But we actually see that the more exercise you do in the gym, running around, the less that you do during the day. So we tend not to be able to change that pattern of that decreasing basal metabolic rate or total daily energy expenditure as we get older. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, the last little component of metabolism that we haven't really spoken about is the thermic effect of eating. So this is the increase in energy expenditure that's associated with consuming and digesting food, and it makes up anywhere between 8 to 15% of our total energy expenditure. Now, the energy expenditure required to digest food doesn't change as we get older. However, we can see some decline with obesity or digestive issues that limit our nutrient absorption. So as we get older, it doesn't change. But if we have obesity or if we have some other digestive issues, that might limit our nutrient absorption and decrease the metabolic effect that we get from eating and digestion. Interestingly, protein-rich foods increase our thermic effect of eating the most, or the thermic effect of feeding. You can call it either one. So it takes our body the most energy to break down protein. So out of our 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are the hardest one for us to break down. They require more energy for us to break down. And that's often why weight loss diets are normally quite high in protein, because we actually use energy and we can burn calories in order to digest that protein. So that's an interesting one. It's also why protein is the most satiating of foods. So if you have a high protein diet, you're likely going to feel a lot fuller than if you have a high fat diet, because the protein takes a little while longer to be digested compared to fats and carbohydrates. So let's have a look at metabolic processes now. So I said that metabolic processes can include anabolic or catabolic reactions. Now, anabolism is described as the building of larger molecules from smaller ones. Catabolism refers to the breakdown of larger molecules into smaller ones. So these terms, you can think of them anabolism, think anabolic steroids. Steroids make you bigger. So anabolic steroids make you bigger. That's what you take if you want to increase your muscles. So anabolism, you're building larger molecules from smaller ones. And then for catabolism, sort of sounds like cannibal, you're breaking down a large person into small bits so you can eat them. So whatever helps you remember these, anabolism is building, catabolism is breaking down. And you can see that I've written some suffixes there after each of those terms. So anabolism, underneath that I've got genesis. So whenever we see a word ending with genesis, that means it's an anabolic reaction, it's a building reaction. For catabolic reactions, you'll always see lysis after the term. So lysis, if you see that on a word, that means it's the breakdown of something. And let's have a look at some of these terms now. So anabolic, we've only got one anabolic term to understand, and that's glycogenesis. It's where glucose is formed into glycogen. And we spoke a bit about that in the last session. So let's think about glycogenesis. So after you've had a big meal, let's say you've had a really high carbohydrate meal, like a big bowl of pasta, your body doesn't need all of that glucose. So you've eaten the food's gotten broken down, you've got a lot of glucose circulating in your blood, your body doesn't need it right now, so instead it's going to convert glucose into glycogen for storage, and that glycogen is stored in the liver and the muscles through glycogenesis. So this is your body's way of ensuring that you've got energy available when you need it later. So think about like when you carb load. So carb loading is something athletes do before they've got a big event. They'll have a high carb meal in the evening. They'll eat all of those carbohydrates. Those carbohydrates will turn into glucose circulating in the blood. Your body doesn't need that glucose right now because you're about to go to bed. The race isn't until tomorrow. So that glucose is going to get stored as glycogen through glycogenesis. And then tomorrow, when you've got your race, you've got plenty of glycogen in your muscles and in your liver that can be broken down and used for energy when you need it tomorrow. We've also got quite a few catabolic reactions. So remember, catabolic, they've got lysis at the end of them. Glycolysis is the first one. So this is when glucose is broken down into ATP and pyruvate. I've put pyruvate in brackets there. We don't need to know about that yet, but it's glucose to ATP, or glucose to energy. So imagine you're preparing for like a 100-meter sprint and your muscles are going to need energy fast. And glycolysis is the process that breaks down glucose and produces ATP. So ATP is that energy that we need for our muscles to function. That happens this happens all in the cytoplasm of the cell, and we're going to see that in the next unit. So it's really important for quick anaerobic activities, this process of glucose turning into ATP. And glycolysis doesn't require oxygen, so it's an anaerobic process. And we're going to talk about that more in the next one. Glycogenolysis is glycogen into glucose. So see, before in our anabolic process, we've stored glucose as glycogen. In glycogenolysis, we're going to break down that glycogen back into glucose. So you're midway through like a high intensity interval training session and your body's already used up all of the glucose that was circulating in the bloodstream. Now it's going to tap into the glycogen stores. It's going to, through glycogenolysis, it's going to break down glycogen into glucose to keep producing that ATP through glycolysis or whatever process it is. So glycogenolysis is very important for maintaining our blood glucose levels during prolonged exercise. And then finally, we have lipolysis. Lipolysis is fat into glucose. So whenever you see that word lipo, always think fat. Think like liposuction is the removal of fat. Lipolysis is fat broken down into glucose. So think of yourself doing some sort of long endurance activity. That's when lipolysis is important. So your body has gotten rid of all the glucose circulating in the bloodstream. It's gotten rid of the glycogen stores. We don't have any more energy left from glucose or glycogen in this case. So to continue this prolonged endurance exercise, your body's going to start breaking down its fat stores through lipolysis. So in this process, we convert triglycerides into glucose, and then that can be used to generate more ATP. So lipolysis is much slower than glycolysis, so it's a very slow way of getting energy when we're using fat, but it provides sort of a steady energy supply for prolonged low intensity activities. So even, going for a hike for a couple of hours, you'd be tapping into that lipolysis. Okay, so that's our glycogen stores. So if we go back to this picture, we've got our glucose, and then we've got our glycogen. So remember, glycogen is just those long linked chains of glucose molecules. Glucose turns into glycogen through glycogenesis, and then glycogen turns back into glucose through glycogenolysis. All right, glycogen storage. So we said before that when we've got too much glucose circulating in the bloodstream, the body's going to convert that glucose to glycogen through glycogenesis. Then that glycogen gets stored, and it gets stored for quick energy when we need it, and it can be broken back down into glucose for the body to use to create ATP. It's stored in the liver and in the muscles. Now, what's really interesting is that the body can only store around 500 grams of glycogen. Once there's 500 grams of glycogen, excess glucose gets stored into fat. So if we're eating a lot of processed high-carb foods all the time, and we're not using the glycogen that we've already got stored, say we're not doing any physical activity, that's when that glucose gets stored into fat, and that's how our body fat increases. Okay, glycogenolysis now. So we've got the stored glycogen in our liver and our muscles, and it's broken down into glucose to meet high energy demands. So when your body's engaging in high intensity exercise, think like a CrossFit style workout, you're really sweating, you're breathing hard, your body needs glucose. It needs a lot of glucose to keep creating that ATP to maintain that high intensity exercise. So to meet this demand, the process of glycogenolysis kicks in, where stored glycogen in your muscles is broken down into glucose. So this rapid breakdown is really important for sustaining your energy level during an intense, high intensity workout. And without sufficient glycogenolysis, your muscles will run out of energy very quickly, and that will lead to fatigue. So really important to have adequate glycogen stores for optimal athletic performance. But if we've got too much glucose coming in for too long and we're not using those glycogen stores, we're not doing any physical activity, that's when that glucose turns into fat and gets stored as body fat. Let's keep talking about fat now. So we've spoken about glycogen storage and the breakdown of glycogen. Let's now look at fat storage and the breakdown of fat. So triglycerides are our long-term energy reserve. Remember, there's a few different words for fat. So fat, you might see it come up as triglyceride storage, as that prefix lipo, that also means fat. So whenever you see these terms, just think fat. So triglycerides are stored in our adipose tissue, which is another name for fat, and muscles. So there is actually fat in your muscles, in your muscle cells. Now, this is the body's long-term energy reserves. So think of triglycerides as sort of like your savings account. So during prolonged periods of low food intake, so say you go on a low calorie diet, or you're doing loads of sustained exercise, you're running marathons, your body's going to tap into these fat stores through lipolysis. So for example, in that marathon, once you've burned through your glycogen stores, your body's going to start breaking down triglycerides in your fat cells and in your muscles to keep you going. So let's consider like a long distance runner again, the marathon runner. After about an hour of running, the glycogen stores will begin to deplete, and the body then shifts to lipolysis, where it breaks down these triglycerides into glucose. That's converted into ATP in the cells through a process called beta oxidation. All right, so lipolysis is the process where fats are broken down into glucose. So as glycogen stores deplete, the body shifts to lipolysis. It's very important for endurance athletes, so it's sustained, steady energy over a long duration, and beta oxidation is that term for the breakdown of fatty acids during lipolysis that generates ATP and energy. Okay, we're going to talk about how this process is regulated by hormones now. So there's 3 hormones we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. The first one being insulin, and in its simplest form, insulin decreases blood glucose. Whenever you see that term blood glucose, what we're referring to there is blood sugar. So you might have heard someone say before that, oh, I've got high blood sugar, I've got low blood sugar. What they mean is blood glucose. So we're referring to the same thing here. So insulin decreases the amount of glucose that's circulating in our blood. And that can either be by using the glucose through glycolysis, where we're using that glucose to create energy, or storing that glucose through glycogenesis, and we're turning it into glycogen. It's being stored in the liver and in the muscles. Glucagon increases the blood glucose through glycogenolysis. So glucagon is important for breaking down that glycogen, turning it back into glucose so that glucose can be used by the body. And adrenaline does the same thing, but it's at more of a rapid rate. So it rapidly increases blood glucose through glycogenolysis, breaking down the glycogen, turning it into glucose so it can be used by the body. All right, so we're going to talk about these 3 a little bit more. Insulin, firstly. So insulin plays a really important role in the body's energy regulation, especially following meals. So after we eat, insulin is going to be really important. So insulin, it's a hormone. It's produced by the pancreas. And you can think of it as a key. Think of insulin as a key that unlocks the doors of our cells and allows glucose to enter. So when there's glucose in our bloodstream, we need insulin to come in and help glucose to enter the cells to be used as energy. It also helps in storing that glucose as glycogen in the liver and the muscles for later use. So it's a really important process for maintaining our energy balance and ensuring that our cells function properly. Okay, so glucose uptake by cells, again, like I said, insulin is the key. So when we eat a high carb meal, we're getting more glucose circulating in our bloodstream. When that key unlocks, that glucose or that insulin unlocks the door to the cells, that glucose can go into the cells and be uptaken and used for energy, or it helps it get into the liver and the muscle for storage. Something else important about insulin is it inhibits lipolysis. So insulin suppresses lipolysis and prioritizes glucose storage as glycogen or fat over fat burning. So glucose is either stored as glycogen, or if that glycogen store is already at its max, glucose is stored as fat. So when we have a high carb meal and we produce insulin, we're unable to use fat as energy. So your body will store the glucose as glycogen or fat instead of actually burning fat. So when there's insulin present in the bloodstream, we aren't able to go through this process of lipolysis and use fat as energy. All right, number 2 is glucagon. So glucagon is released by the pancreas during fasting or between meals. So this is when you haven't eaten in a while. So glucagon is going to come into play when you haven't eaten in a while. It triggers glycogenolysis. So when you haven't eaten in a while, you don't have that glucose circulating in your bloodstream. If your blood sugar drops too low, then glucagon is going to come into play and make sure the liver and the muscles release some of that glycogen as glucose to maintain a healthy blood glucose level. So we want some glucose in our blood to be used as energy. If we've got really low blood sugar, that's not good. That's called hypoglycemia. So the role of glucagon is to prevent hypoglycemia. So if your blood sugar drops below the healthy range, it can cause certain symptoms like shakiness and a faster heart rate, and it can actually be life-threatening if it goes too low. So when you haven't eaten for a while, or if you're fasting and you don't have that glucose coming in through your digestive system, through the carbohydrates you're eating, glucagon's going to kick into play to get some glucose out to your cells to provide you with energy. And then lastly is adrenaline. So adrenaline is the body's immediate response to stress or intense exercise. It's a hormone that is released when we're in a stressful situation or we start doing intense exercise, and it rapidly accelerates glycogenolysis, making glucose readily available to the muscles, and that's part of our flight or fight response. So when the body prepares itself for quick action in an emergency, it ensures that our muscles are ready for immediate use. So think about if you're, in a really scary situation, you're about to be mugged or something, you have this fight or fight response where the adrenaline just goes all the way up in your body and you start to feel your heart race and you get maybe sweaty palms. That adrenaline is also triggering glycogenolysis, where the glycogen is releasing the glucose back into the bloodstream to be used by the body so that you're able to run away. Your muscles have got all the energy that they need to be able to do that. Okay, so insulin and muscle contraction during exercise. So moving on to the next, or one of the final topics now. So during exercise, the body optimizes glucose uptake into the muscles through the combined actions of insulin and muscle contraction. So it's actually quite interesting that as our muscles contract, so say we're running, our muscles are contracting over and over and over again, that makes them more sensitive to insulin. So that means that even small amounts of insulin can significantly enhance the glucose uptake into the muscle cells. So with exercise and with muscle contraction, we actually become more sensitive to the insulin in our body, and we're able to get more glucose into those muscle cells. And that's really important for maintaining energy levels during prolonged or intense exercise, that we don't actually need as much insulin. As exercise intensity ramps up, insulin levels naturally decrease, and that reduction in insulin levels allows glycogenolysis to take over, ensuring that the muscles have a continuous supply of glucose to meet the energy demands of the physical activity that we're doing. So as exercise intensity increases, it's actually very interesting to see that insulin levels decrease, allowing glycogenolysis to kick in. Okay, so a little summary of what we've spoken about so far. The interplay of the hormones that we've spoken about, insulin, glucagon, and adrenaline, is really important in regulating our body's energy balance, because we know that when we've got too much glucose circulating and we've got all this stored glycogen, that glucose is going to turn into fat. So insulin primarily facilitates the glucose uptake within the cells and the glucose storage as glycogen. Glucagon and adrenaline are critical during fasting and stress. So remember, glucagon is important when you haven't eaten. It releases some energy so that you're able to sort of maintain your life. And then adrenaline is released during stress and exercise to initiate glycogenolysis, so that we've got glucose and we've got energy available when we need it. So altogether, these hormones maintain our glucose and fat metabolism, or our carbohydrate and fat metabolism, making their balance really important for metabolic health. So if these hormones are out of whack, we're going to have quite a few issues. And one of those issues, the most common one that we know of, is diabetes. So diabetes is a chronic condition, and it impacts the body's ability to manage blood glucose levels. So There's two types of diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2. They're quite different. So in type 1 diabetes, normally you're born with it. And what happens is the pancreas produces little to no insulin. In type 2 diabetes, normally you're not born with it. You get it as you get older. It's characterized by insulin resistance. So in this case, the body still produces insulin, but the cells aren't responsive to it. And over time, because of this, the pancreas might produce less insulin. So in both types, this disruption in insulin can lead to quite a few various complications. So in type 1, we don't have enough insulin production. In type 2, the body's just not using that insulin. The body's not able to identify and use that insulin as it otherwise would. Over time, with diabetes and this imbalance in the hormonal regulation of carbohydrates and fats, it can lead to various health complications, including cardiovascular disease, nerve damage, or kidney disease. So it's really important to maintain proper hormonal regulation and watching out for the foods that we eat in order to not develop these kind of diseases. Okay, that's all for 3.2.